Nick Hale had constructed his existence around the principle of control. He was a figure who foresaw every possibility, who allowed no feelings to disrupt reason. Yet, it only required a single evening, a simple dinner in an ordinary restaurant, for his entire world to come crashing down. Upon hearing the soft cries of a child, he was taken aback by the unexpected surge of concern that washed over him. The instant he caught sight of her expansive blue eyes, mirroring his own, he was taken aback by the emotions that surged within him. As her mother spun around, ghostly pale and frozen in place, murmuring his name like a haunting echo from days gone by, he realized that nothing would ever return to its former state. Because the young girl was more than merely a wandering soul. She was his child. He had been completely unaware of her existence. Nicholas, known as Nick Hale, was accustomed to being in charge. In the realm of commerce, during discussions, and throughout existence, everything adhered to a strategy. Everything unfolded as expected, with no unexpected twists, no chances overlooked, and no unresolved matters. That was the foundation of his company, the essence of his enduring success. Yet this evening, after many years, he had distanced himself from the rigid realm of corporate gatherings and investor soirees, opting for a new path. He sought a tranquil dining experience, a place removed from the typical opulence, where he could blend into the background. He discovered a quaint, family-run eatery nestled on the fringes of the city. The atmosphere was inviting, infused with the delightful aromas of warm, freshly baked bread and savory grilled steak wafting through the space. A setting where time seemed to stand still, where joy resonated in the air and laughter echoed from the booths, replacing the usual quiet of business discussions. The servers moved swiftly among the tables, acknowledging familiar faces with warm greetings, creating an atmosphere rich with a sense of belonging. Nick selected a table by the window, opting for a steak accompanied by a glass of wine. He granted himself a fleeting pause to just sit and breathe, to observe his surroundings free from the burden of looming deadlines. It was peculiar how foreign the sensation of relaxation seemed. Just as he was poised to savor his first sip of wine, a sound pierced the serene ambience of the restaurant, a soft, quivering sob. He lifted his eyes, surveying the space until they settled on a diminutive shape by the counter. A young girl sat on the floor, her delicate shoulders trembling as she dabbed at her face with her small fists. She must have been no more than 4. Her dark curls framed a round face, and even from afar, Nick could discern the vivid blue of her eyes, brimming with tears. A constriction gripped his chest. He was not the sort of individual to engage in personal affairs, much less the dilemmas of those he did not know. Yet there was something about this little girl, perched alone on the floor of a bustling restaurant, her expression one of confusion and fear, that rendered it impossible to divert one's gaze. He pushed back his chair and rose, swiftly crossing the room in just a few strides. He lowered himself next to her, careful not to surprise her. "Hey," he spoke softly. "Are you doing all right?" The young child whimpered softly, gazing up at him with cheeks marked by tears. "I'm adrift," she murmured. Nick experienced an unexpected surge of worry. He had anticipated hearing phrases such as, "I lost my toy," or, "I made a mess with my drink." Yet misplaced. That was unique. He surveyed the restaurant, his eyes darting about in search of a frantic parent, yet no one appeared to be looking for a lost child. That only intensified his worry. "May I ask what your name is?" he inquired, maintaining a steady tone. The girl paused, then brushed her nose with the cuff of her small sweater. "Lily." Nick nodded, giving her a comforting smile. "Lily is such a lovely name. Where is your mother?" Her lips trembled once more, and she gave a slight shake of her head. "She was present, yet she departed. She mentioned she would return shortly. Yet I was unable to locate her." Nick let out a slow breath, coming to terms with what had likely occurred. If her mother was employed here, she likely had just momentarily stepped away, trusting Lily to remain in one place. In the midst of the bustling restaurant, little Lily had strayed away instead. He found himself grappling with an inexplicable urge to assist. He had the option to summon a waitress, allow them to take care of it, and return to his table with his pristine steak waiting for him. Yet, the way Lily's wide, terrified eyes looked up at him anchored him to the spot. "Is your mother employed here?" he inquired. Lily gave a slight nod. "She works as a server." That settled it. Nick scanned the room once more, noticing several waitresses maneuvering through the tables, trays expertly balanced on their arms, yet none appeared to be searching for a child. "Very well," he replied. "Shall we embark on this quest to locate her together?" Lily paused briefly, then gently placed her petite hand into his significantly larger grasp. The unexpected warmth enveloped him. He found himself unaccustomed to grasping something so tiny, so fragile. It felt strange. As they strolled through the restaurant, on the lookout for Lily's mother, Nick remained blissfully unaware that this moment, this seemingly trivial choice, would alter the course of his life in ways he could never imagine. Nick strolled deliberately through the restaurant, his substantial hand gently cradling Lily's petite one as he surveyed the bustling room. The delicate touch of her fingers seemed almost ephemeral against his palm, prompting him to hold her a bit more securely, as if fearing she could vanish at any moment. Lily remained near him, her free hand gripping the edge of her petite sweater. Her large blue eyes flitted about the restaurant, searching for a recognizable figure, yet with each step, her uncertainty deepened. "Can you recall her location the last time you encountered her?" Nick inquired softly, his tone tender. Lily paused for a moment, then gestured to the distant side of the restaurant, where a counter was adorned with piles of menus and a cash register. "She mentioned that she was over there. She went to deliver food to someone, and after that, I lost sight of her." Nick gave a slight nod, guiding her toward that path. The restaurant buzzed with energy, yet as they approached the counter, an unmistakable change lingered in the air. A voice pierced the clamor, urgent and laced with concern. "Lily." Lily's attention was instantly captured as she turned toward the sound. A woman hurried toward them, navigating through tables with the desperation of someone who had been searching for far too long. She donned a modest black dress, an apron cinched at her waist, and her brown hair was gathered into a relaxed ponytail. Her dark eyes were filled with fear until they found Lily, and a wave of relief transformed her expression. Lily's expression brightened. "Mother." Before Nick had a chance to respond, the little girl released his hand and dashed directly into her mother's embrace. The woman lifted her, cradling her closely against her heart. "Oh my goodness, darling, where have you vanished to?" Her voice trembled softly as she caressed Lily's hair, planting a gentle kiss on the crown of her head. "I instructed you to remain close to the counter." "I did," Lily whispered, her voice barely audible as she turned her face away. "But then you were gone, and fear crept in." The woman breathed out unsteadily, momentarily shutting her eyes before leaning back to examine her daughter's expression. "Are you all right? You're not injured?" Lily shook her head. "I'm all right." Nick, who had stepped back to allow them some distance, felt himself paralyzed as the woman finally raised her eyes to meet his. In that moment, everything changed. Nick recognized those eyes. The hue was altered, a deep brown replacing Lily's vibrant blue, yet the shape, the way they widened in surprise, the way they mirrored something deep and unexpressed, felt all too familiar. He knew her. She recognized him. A pause lingered in the air, thick and weighty. "Nick?" Her voice emerged softly, almost as if she were questioning the reality of the sight before her. Nick sensed a constriction in his chest. That voice hadn't graced his ears in years, yet it was unmistakable. "Rose," he uttered, his tone softer than normal. Her hold on Lily became a bit firmer, almost instinctively. Nick found himself frozen, unable to move or think. As he gazed at her, truly gazed, a sudden understanding struck him with such force it almost stole his breath away. Lily. Dark hair. Blue eyes. She was more than an ordinary little girl. She was not merely a lost child in a restaurant. She mirrored him perfectly. Nick's stomach plummeted. His hands clenched into fists as he struggled to steady his breath. He shifted his focus back to Rose, his jaw clenching. "Tell me the truth," he said, his voice low and tense. His heart raced as he posed the question that would alter everything. "Is she my daughter?" Rose felt her breath catch in her throat. Her arms instinctively tightened around Lily, as if she could somehow protect her child from the gravity of the moment. She had envisioned this scenario countless times, pondering what she would say if she ever encountered Nick again. Yet she had never been ready for the genuine article. Nick stood before her, his broad shoulders taut, his blue eyes fixed on her with a fervor that sent chills racing down her spine. He had always possessed that aura, the sort that commanded responses without uttering a word. Yet now, there was an unmistakable shift in his gaze, an intensity that felt unyielding, something she found impossible to evade. "Is she my daughter?" His voice lowered, yet the urgency in his tone lingered. Rose's heart raced within her chest. She had always anticipated this moment. Yet, she never imagined it would unfold in the midst of a bustling restaurant, with Lily's tiny arms clinging to her neck, unaware of the turmoil that was about to erupt. She swallowed hard, her throat feeling parched. Lying was out of the question. She had concealed the truth from him for years, and now, with Lily standing there, resembling a tiny version of him, there was no way to avoid it. Rose shut her eyes for a fleeting moment before locking eyes with him once more. "Indeed," she murmured, her voice scarcely audible. "She belongs to you." The ensuing silence was overwhelming. Nick remained still, silent, his gaze fixed on her. His face was a mask of inscrutability, as if he were grappling with the gravity of her words. Rose steeled herself for the storm of emotions, anger, accusations, anything that might come her way. Yet, the expression in his eyes transcended mere anger, it hinted at a profound sense of betrayal. "How long?" His tone remained steady, but the underlying tension was unmistakable. Rose took a deep breath. "For years." Nick let out a quick breath, raking his fingers through his dark hair. "For years," he echoed the words, as if voicing them would somehow bring them to life. He glanced at Lily, who observed them with a silent intrigue, blissfully ignorant of the significance woven into their exchange. "Why didn't you confide in me?" His tone had softened, yet the underlying tension was unmistakable. Rose's fingers gently curled against Lily's back. "You have your whole life ahead of you," she said, striving to maintain her composure. "You are building an empire." There were investors, meetings, and deals amounting to millions. "You traveled the globe, hardly pausing for anything." She interrupted, shaking her head. "I never intended to be the one who restrained you." Nick let out a soft, mirthless chuckle, shaking his head in disbelief. "Restrained me?" His blue eyes pierced through hers. "You didn't believe I had the authority to make that decision for myself." Rose's chest constricted. "I believed I was making the correct choice." Nick's jaw tightened. "The correct choice." His voice had dropped, taking on a rough edge. "You made the choice for me, Rose. You determined that I was unworthy of knowing my own daughter. She felt unworthy of being there for her." Rose flinched, the burden of guilt pressing down on her. "It wasn't as it seemed." "Then enlighten me," Nick retorted, his frustration piercing through his typically composed demeanor. "Explain how you rationalized keeping her away from me for 4 long years." Rose took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his words. She confessed her fear. She feared that you might perceive her as a blunder. That you might feel confined. That you might harbor resentment towards both of us. Nick's expression shifted momentarily, but then his jaw clenched once more. "You can't be certain of that." "You're right," Rose whispered. "I don't. Because I never allowed you the opportunity. For an extended period, silence enveloped them. The atmosphere was heavy with feelings that eluded their understanding. At last, Nick inhaled deeply, his eyes returning to Lily. The young girl remained comfortably cradled in her mother's embrace, her fingers idly toying with the edge of the sleeve, blissfully oblivious to the chaos around her. Nick knelt down, bringing himself to her level. "Hey, Lily," he said, his tone gentle and soothing. Lily blinked at him, her wide blue eyes filled with curiosity. "Hi." Nick paused for just a moment before inquiring, "Do you know who I am?" Lily tilted her head slightly, as if she were examining him closely. She turned her gaze to Rose, seeking a nod of assurance before returning her attention to him. "You're the nice man who helped me," she stated plainly. Nick exhaled, giving a slight nod in response. "Indeed," he remarked. "I'm the kind individual who assisted you." He paused, his tone now more subdued. "Yet, there's more to me than meets the eye." Lily's brow knitted together, her bright blue eyes sparkling with curiosity. "What is it?" Nick felt a lump in his throat. His throat felt constricted, as if the words were trapped deep within him. For years, he had shielded himself, burying emotions beneath layers of professionalism and restraint. Yet, gazing into his daughter's eyes, mirroring his own, there was no space for anything other than the unvarnished truth. "I'm your dad," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Lily blinked at him, as if trying to process his words. She glanced at Rose again, then back at Nick. "Really?" Nick managed a faint smile, though the burden in his chest felt almost unbearable. "Yeah," he replied. "Really?" Lily held his gaze for a moment longer before a subtle smile began to form at the edges of her mouth. "Oh." Nick exhaled, a breath he hadn't known he was holding. Then, to his utter astonishment, Lily extended her hand and grasped his. In that moment, Nick felt every part of him freeze in place. Her fingers were small, delicate, warm. For the first time in his life, Nicholas Hale, a man who had constructed an empire from the ground up, a man who had always kept others at bay, sensed he had discovered something far more significant than anything he had ever created. Nick gazed down at the tiny hand entwined with his, feeling a profound change stir within him. Lily's delicate fingers wrapped around his hand, exuding a quiet confidence that caused his heart to race. Despite years of negotiating high-stakes deals and commanding presence in boardrooms filled with influential figures, he felt utterly unprepared in this moment. Her blue eyes, mirroring his own, gazed up at him with innocent curiosity, as if anticipating his next move. She felt no fear. She made no move to retreat. She was simply present. Gripping his hand as if it were the most instinctive action imaginable, Nick felt a lump in his throat, his thoughts swirling chaotically. Anger should have consumed him. He ought to have been insisting on answers, pressing to understand why Rose had concealed this from him for such an extended period. Yet, as he stood there, gazing at Lily, all that occupied his mind was the realization of how much time had slipped away from him. For years. For years filled with first words, first steps, bedtime stories, scraped knees, and laughter, memories that would remain forever out of reach. Rose's voice shattered the stillness. "Lily, darling, why don't you take a seat at the counter for a moment? I have something to discuss too." She paused, casting a glance at Nick before continuing, "I need to speak with Mr. Hale." Lily glanced between them, picking up on the tension in her mother's voice, yet she chose not to protest. Instead, she offered Nick's hand a final squeeze before releasing it and skipping over to the counter, effortlessly climbing onto a stool. The moment she was out of earshot, Nick faced Rose, his jaw clenched. "We must have a conversation. Immediately." Rose took a breath, acknowledging with a nod. "I understand." Nick tightened his fists, striving to maintain his composure. "Why?" The question escaped him, laced with a tumult of feelings he hadn't yet had the chance to sort through. "Why didn't you say anything?" Rose glanced away for a moment, her arms wrapping around herself as if seeking protection. "I was afraid," she confessed. "I thought that if I opened up, you might feel cornered. It's as if you were forced to decide between your own existence and an unexpected child." Nick exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "That decision wasn't yours to make, Rose. You have no right to dictate my feelings. You cannot remove me from my daughter's life based on your assumptions about my desires." Her jaw tightened. "You were unprepared, Nick. I sensed it. You felt it too." She poured herself into 18-hour days, traversing the globe, crafting her empire. There was no room for self-care, much less for a child. Nick moved in closer, his blue eyes piercing through to her very core. "That doesn't mean I wouldn't have attempted it." Rose flinched slightly at his words, yet she maintained her gaze. "I believed I was making the right choice," she whispered. Nick let out a breath, his fingers raking through his dark hair. "Well, you weren't," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You took 4 years from me. You stripped me of my chance to understand her, to support her. And now I'm just meant to accept this." Rose's throat constricted. "I didn't intend to cause you pain, Nick." "But you did," he murmured, his voice softer yet still charged with emotion. "You caused pain for both of us." An oppressive silence enveloped them, thick with all that remained unspoken. Nick inhaled deeply, pushing himself to move beyond the anger, beyond the resentment. The past was unchangeable. No matter how desperately he wished it were different, no matter how much it gnawed at him, those 4 years had slipped away. But Lily wasn't. His voice gained a firmer quality as he continued. "I'm not walking away from her, Rose." Rose swallowed hard, nodding. "I didn't anticipate you would." Nick examined her closely, looking for any indication that she might still resist him on this. Yet all he perceived was fatigue. Remorse. And perhaps a hint of something else, akin to solace. He cast a quick look at the counter, where Lily was joyfully swinging her legs, toying with a small napkin as if it were the most captivating object in existence. His daughter. He redirected his attention to Rose. "We must come to a resolution. For her." Rose nodded once more, her tone gentler this time. "Indeed." At that moment, Nick sensed he was reclaiming a sense of control for the first time that night. Yet this time, the focus shifted away from business and power. It centered on fatherhood. Nick had dedicated his life to unraveling challenges, brokering difficult agreements, and transforming barriers into possibilities. As he faced Rose in the cozy booth of the restaurant, he understood that this moment transcended any typical negotiation. There were no tactics, no shortcuts, no agreements that could amend the past 4 years or reclaim the time lost with his daughter. Rose sat opposite him, her body language tight, her fingers clutching the table's edge as if preparing for a dialogue she had long evaded. Lily remained seated at the counter, joyfully sipping her juice, her tiny legs swinging beneath the stool. She was completely oblivious to the emotional turmoil unfolding just a few feet away. Nick leaned in, resting his forearms on the table. His voice remained calm, yet the undercurrent of frustration was unmistakable. "I need to be part of her life, Rose. I don't care how we make it happen, but I'm not stepping away from her." Rose took a deep breath, her eyes drifting to the table before she met his gaze once more. "I understand," she confessed. "And I won't stand in your way." Nick observed her intently. He had anticipated greater opposition, more doubt. Yet the way she expressed it, so assured, so accepting, indicated to him that she had come to terms with the reality that preventing him from being close was no longer feasible. He nodded, his fingers tangling in his hair. "Good. Because I'm not seeking approval." Rose's lips formed a firm line. "I didn't believe you were." A pause lingered in the air, heavy with all the unspoken words between them. Nick felt an undeniable urge to be woven into the fabric of Lily's life, a necessity that pulsed within him. Yet, he understood that such a connection couldn't be forged in an instant. She was a stranger to him, and despite his longing to reclaim the moments they had missed, he recognized that earning her trust would require patience and time. Rose seemed to sense the unspoken words etched on his expression, letting out a sigh as her hands relaxed their hold on the table. She confessed, "She doesn't know anything about you." "I never did. I never mentioned you to her." Nick tightened his jaw, yet he compelled himself to remain composed. "Not even my name." Rose shook her head. She had once asked, long ago, why she didn't have a dad like some of the other kids at daycare. I explained that families come in various shapes and sizes, and that ours was simply the two of us. After that, she ceased her inquiries. Nick felt a constriction in his chest. She has a right to the truth. I understand, Rose said, her voice trembling for the first time that night. But you must realize, Nick, she has never experienced having a father figure in her life. She doesn't comprehend what that truly signifies. She's accustomed to it being just the two of us. Nick breathed out, struggling to suppress the emotions that were bubbling to the surface. Then we take it slow, he said. I want to be careful not to burden her. Rose paused for a moment before giving a slight nod. All right. Nick reclined in the booth, grappling with the rapid shifts in his reality. Just hours earlier, he had entered the restaurant anticipating a peaceful meal, and now he found himself face to face with the mother of his child, navigating the complexities of becoming a father to a daughter he had only just discovered. Rose's tone softened a bit. She has feelings for you, you realize. Nick's gaze lifted to connect with hers. It's true. Rose nodded, casting a glance at the counter where Lily was now sketching on a napkin with a red crayon provided by the waitress. She's not typically at ease around unfamiliar faces. Yet, she allowed you to hold her hand. That's not something she does frequently. Nick felt a lump rise in his throat. He glanced at Lily once more, observing the way she furrowed her brow in focus as she meticulously traced a shape on the napkin. He knew he hadn't earned this immediate acceptance from her, yet he wasn't about to let it slip away. I want to take her out sometime, he finally said. Not today, not tomorrow, but soon. It was just the two of us. Rose paused for a moment, then gave a slight nod. We can give that a shot. Nick let out a slow breath, feeling a bit of the tightness in his shoulders lift for the first time since this discussion began. It wasn't ideal. It wasn't sufficient. It marked the beginning of something new. For the moment, that was all he could hope for. Nick reached the park ahead of schedule, walking back and forth near the playground as he attempted to calm the fluttering anxiety within him. 2 days had passed since his talk with Rose, 2 days since the revelation of his daughter, and still, everything felt like a dream. Those nights were spent in restless contemplation, the moment looping endlessly in his mind, grappling with the profound shift in his life that had unfolded in just one evening. He felt no fear of the responsibilities ahead. He had constructed a vast realm from nothing, made choices that influenced countless lives, maneuvered through pressures that would have shattered most individuals. Yet, this was unlike anything else. This transcended mere commerce. This moment felt intimate. A breeze stirred the fallen leaves, and Nick turned his gaze to the park entrance just as Rose emerged, holding hands with Lily. He felt a slight catch in his breath as he observed them, noting how Lily bounced with each step, animatedly sharing her thoughts with her mother, her small hands dancing in the air. Rose appeared more reserved, her shoulders tense, as if she was still bracing for the unfolding events. Nick swallowed hard, compelling himself to suppress the nerves creeping up his spine. He refused to let them overpower him. He had waited an eternity for this moment, though he hadn't realized it until now. Lily was the first to notice him. She halted mid-sentence, her eyes widening as she seemed to evaluate whether he was still the same man she had met at the restaurant. To his astonishment, she beamed. You're here, she declared, pulling at Rose's hand before dashing off. Nick hardly had a moment to respond before she was upon him, halting just a breath away as she looked up at him with an inquisitive gaze. "Did you bring me a book?" Nick exhaled, a breath he hadn't known he was holding. Among all the possibilities, her words caught him off guard. Yet, they brought a smile to his face. "I did," he said, reaching into his coat pocket and pulling out a small, hardcover storybook. "Your mom told me you like fairy tales." Lily gasped dramatically, clutching her hands to her chest. "I adore fairy tales." She gently took the book from his hands, examining it closely with her tiny fingers. "Are there dragons?" Nick knelt down to meet her gaze, nodding in response. "Large creatures. And princesses who face them without fear." Lily smiled. "I have a fondness for princesses who take on dragons. They possess a certain allure that surpasses those who merely await a prince." Nick let out a chuckle, his gaze shifting to Rose, who observed them with a watchful demeanor. He sensed her struggle to understand how effortlessly Lily had warmed up to him. He couldn't fault her for it, he was equally taken aback. "Would you like me to read it to you?" he inquired, redirecting his focus to Lily. She pondered for a brief moment before nodding with excitement. "But only if we sit on the swings. It's the ultimate setting for tales." Nick paused, casting a glance at Rose for her consent. She offered a slight nod, her lips pressed together as if she were still contemplating her feelings on the matter. "Swings it is," Nick said, straightening up. Lily took his hand without a moment's pause, guiding him toward the playground. Nick allowed himself to be led, still amazed by how effortlessly she embraced him. He had anticipated distance, hesitation, perhaps even resistance. Yet, she responded as though he had always belonged there, as if he were already woven into the fabric of her world. When they arrived at the swings, Lily hopped onto one, swinging gently, inviting him to take the seat next to her. Nick complied, cradling the book in his lap as he flipped it open. Lily leaned in eagerly, her legs bouncing slightly in anticipation of his words. He started to read, his voice unwavering, though his mind wandered beyond the text. His thoughts wandered to the little girl beside him, captivated by her rapt attention and the trust she placed in him without hesitation. It was a humbling experience like no other. Midway through the tale, Lily unexpectedly grasped his sleeve, giving it a gentle tug. "You have a lovely voice," she remarked with a straightforward tone. "Like a prince." Nick blinked, taken aback. He couldn't quite pinpoint the reason, but her words resonated within him profoundly. Rose, positioned a short distance away, chuckled softly, shaking her head. "That's a first," she whispered. Nick smirked, shaking his head before turning back to Lily. "You think so?" he asked. Lily nodded solemnly. "Yep. A prince, perhaps, or a gallant knight." Nick leaned in a bit closer, his voice dropping to a teasing whisper. "Knights, after all, are the ones who battle dragons, you see." Lily's eyes grew wide with surprise. "That means you could be one," she exclaimed. Nick let out a soft chuckle as he turned the page. "It seems we'll have to wait and see." Rose continued to observe them, her arms crossed, yet her expression had softened, revealing a hint of surprise. Nick sensed that she was witnessing something unforeseen. They lingered at the park for hours, engaging in play, conversation, and diving into more stories. As the moment to depart arrived, Lily embraced Nick without a moment's pause, her petite arms encircling his waist. He momentarily stiffened before softly reciprocating the hug, a sensation in his chest tightening at the unforeseen display of affection. While Rose guided her to the car, Lily glanced back, waving goodbye. "Farewell, Knight Nick." Nick let out a chuckle, shaking his head as he returned the wave. Rose hesitated for a moment before finally locking eyes with him. "That exceeded my expectations." Nick nodded in agreement. Indeed. Indeed, there remained a vast expanse of understanding to explore. Countless dialogues awaited to unfold. For the first time since everything began, Nick experienced a sense of tranquility. In that moment, it was sufficient. He couldn't shake the memory of how Lily had embraced him before departing the park. It was a seemingly insignificant act, one that many parents likely overlooked, yet for him, it held immense significance. He was caught off guard. He had hardly known how to respond when her tiny arms enveloped him, filled with trust and warmth. And yet, in that moment, a sense of calm washed over him, something that had been stirring within since the night he uncovered the truth. Now, 2 days later, he found himself outside Rose's apartment, shifting his weight as he awaited her to open the door. He had received an invitation this time, but that did little to ease his nerves. He remained an outsider in their realm, seeking to understand his place within it. The door swung open, revealing Rose, her brown eyes meticulously assessing his face, maintaining the familiar guarded demeanor she typically displayed in his presence. Yet, there was a subtle shift this time, an air of less defensiveness. She quietly moved aside, allowing him entry. The apartment, though compact, exuded warmth. The living room brimmed with bookshelves, adorned with a handful of framed photographs, and featured a couch that bore the marks of countless memories. It wasn't opulent or showy, but it had a warmth that felt like home. For the first time, Nick understood how little he truly knew about the life Rose had created for herself and their daughter. "Lily's in her room," Rose said, gently shutting the door behind him. "Since the park, she hasn't stopped mentioning you." A warm sensation blossomed in Nick's chest at that thought. He turned to face Rose completely. "That's a positive indication, isn't it?" She nodded slowly, her arms crossed. "Yes, it is." Just as he was about to speak, the sound of small, hurried footsteps filled the hallway. Moments later, Lily burst into view, clad in a vibrant yellow princess dress, her plastic tiara askew atop her head. She froze upon spotting him, her eyes sparkling with delight. "You arrived." Nick grinned, bending down a bit. "I promised you I would." Lily radiated joy as she raised the hem of her dress and spun around. "I'm a princess today," she declared, "but not the type that sits around waiting for a prince. The type that battles dragons." Nick let out a soft laugh. "That's the finest kind of princess." Lily nodded with a sense of gravity. "Mommy says you're joining us for dinner." Nick stole a glance at Rose, who leaned against the kitchen counter, observing their exchange with a calm demeanor. Rose shrugged, her insistence clear. Lily took his hand, guiding him to the couch. "Do you like spaghetti? Mommy makes the best spaghetti." Nick followed her lead, settling down as she joined him on the couch, her dress billowing around her. "I love spaghetti," he said. "Do I get to help?" Lily gasped. "You want to help?" He smirked, glancing at Rose. "I believe I can handle stirring a pot." Lily chuckled softly, then leaned closer as if she were about to share a crucial secret. "Mommy isn't fond of it when people disrupt her kitchen." Rose cast an exasperated glance from the other side of the room. "Lily, please don't frighten him away before he even gets a chance." Nick chuckled, a strange sensation blooming in his chest. This moment, nestled in their home, as Lily spoke and Rose feigned indifference, felt undeniably authentic. It was something he had never permitted himself to desire, something he had led himself to believe was unnecessary. Yet, in this very instant, he understood just how mistaken he had been. Dinner was effortless. Surprisingly so. Lily filled the air with her chatter, weaving tales about school, her beloved books, and how her stuffed animals each had their own distinct voices during playtime. Nick listened, captivated by the intricacies of her thoughts. Occasionally, Rose would chime in, exasperated by Lily's theatrics or nudging her to focus on her meal rather than just the conversation. Then came the unexpected moment that caught him off guard. After dinner, Lily retrieved a stack of crayons and some sheets of paper, arranging them on the coffee table. She immersed herself in her drawing, her tongue peeking out slightly as she focused. Nick leaned in closer, observing her with interest. Lily glanced up at him, then shifted her gaze to the paper before lifting it for his view. It depicted 3 stick figures, one noticeably smaller than the rest, all joined by their hands. In the background stood a house, a sun nestled in the corner, and a large blue scribble overhead that he presumed represented the sky. She indicated each figure with her finger as she spoke. "This is me. This is Mommy. And this," she pointed to the tallest figure. "This is you." Nick gazed at the drawing, a tightness constricting in his throat. He felt a swirl of uncertainty, grappling with the realization that, in her perspective, he had already woven himself into the fabric of her life. Rose, busy tidying up the table, cast a glance his way. Her gaze softened at the sight of the drawing, yet she remained silent. She allowed the moment to linger, providing him the room to absorb it. Nick cleared his throat, pushing himself to articulate beyond the obstruction. "That's quite an impressive drawing." Lily radiated joy. "Do you enjoy it?" Nick responded with a nod. "I absolutely adore it." Lily appeared content with that response, promptly returning to her coloring of the sky. Nick leaned back, releasing a slow breath as he combed his fingers through his hair. He had devoted his whole life to pursuing success, believing it was the sole thing of importance. As he sat there, observing his daughter sketch their family on a sheet of paper, a realization dawned on him. It wasn't merely a desire to be involved in her life, it was an essential need. Nick found himself lost in thought, gazing at the drawing Lily had created. It was merely a simple picture, filled with vibrant colors and uneven lines, yet to him, it held more significance than any of his accomplishments. His name had graced the covers of Forbes, adorned corporate buildings, and appeared on contracts worth millions, but here it was, sketched in crayon next to 2 stick figures labeled Mommy and Lily, as if he had always been meant to be part of that world. Lily, unaware of the significance of her actions, kept coloring, softly humming to herself. Rose busied herself around the apartment, collecting plates and wiping down the counters, yet occasionally, she found herself glancing at him. Her gaze no longer held anger or even uncertainty. It was a gentle moment, one that made him ponder if she had been anticipating this just as he had. "Lily," Rose finally spoke, shattering the stillness. "It's nearly time for bed." Lily released a theatrical sigh, placing her crayon down as though the burden of duty was overwhelming. "Do I have to?" Rose raised an eyebrow. "Do you wish to be a grumpy dragon tomorrow?" Lily pondered this for a moment before sighing once more, clearly resigned. "Fine." Nick observed her as she rose, stretching her arms before facing him with eager, wide eyes. "Are you going to be here tomorrow?" Nick paused, casting a glance at Rose. Uncertainty clouded his thoughts, he questioned whether he was crossing a line. Yet, before he could voice his concerns, Rose offered a subtle nod, almost imperceptible, yet sufficient to convey her willingness to engage. He turned to Lily, a smile breaking across his face. "Yes." Lily beamed, pleased with his response. She approached him, paused for a brief moment, then enveloped him in a warm embrace, her small arms encircling his waist. Nick hardly had a moment to respond before she dashed away, retreating down the hall to her room. He remained seated for a brief spell, attempting to make sense of the whirlwind that had just unfolded. It had been mere days since he discovered her existence, and yet, in that short time, she had seemingly concluded that he was meant to be a part of her world. Rose leaned against the counter, arms crossed, observing him intently. "She's already attached to you," she said softly. "You can't just vanish." Nick locked eyes with her, a steadfast resolve reflected in his own. "I'm not going anywhere." Rose held his gaze for a prolonged moment before finally nodding. She stepped away from the counter and moved toward the hallway, but just before she vanished from sight, she stopped. "Good night, Nick." It was the first moment she had spoken his name free of tension, free of hesitation, with no barrier between them. He let out a breath, reclining against the couch. Good night, Rose. As he remained there, attuned to the soft sound of Lily's laughter drifting from her room while Rose narrated a bedtime tale, Nick understood that, for the first time in years, he no longer felt as though he was chasing something forever out of reach. He wasn't pursuing another opportunity, another triumph, another figure on a financial statement. For the first time, he found himself precisely where he belonged. And he was determined not to let it slip away.